You're listening to Stealing from Wizards, Volume 2, Burglary, by R.A. Consul. Chapter 4, Trials Beyond Measure. The final week before school was thankfully very busy. Kuro's chores at the orphanage had been doubled, and new ones had been invented as punishment for the duel. It was a gross injustice that he was disciplined for being attacked, but Kuro was getting used to it. Besides, the extra work helped him keep his mind off the lack of mail and his upcoming ordeals. Kuro had to endure 2 more trials before he would be free of the walls of the orphanage: his evocations test and a haircut. He wasn't certain which he dreaded more. The test would be excruciating, hours of written exams followed by practical demonstration of his abilities. The outcome of that was all but certain. He wasn't consistent with any of the skills and hadn't once successfully moved anything via telekinesis. He couldn't imagine them passing him on to the next grade without his being able to do one of the first things students learned. It would be an afternoon of desperate struggle towards an inevitable failure. The haircut was a whole different kind of anxiety. He'd never had anyone else cut his hair. The idea of sitting entirely still while someone played with blades around his head and neck was terrifying. Given the choice, he'd rather duel Azalea again. When the fateful day came, Kuro was as mentally prepared as he could be. That is, he had barely slept or eaten. What sleep he did get was full of nightmares, and the food he had managed to get down wasn't keen to stay there. The hairdresser came to the orphanage bright and early, and Kuro had been nominated to go first since he had such a big day ahead with his tests. The hairdresser was tall and lean, dressed in all tightly tailored black clothes. His hair was fiery orange on one side and blue on the other. The effect was that of an explosion colliding with a waterfall. It was clearly intentional, though Kuro couldn't imagine why anyone would do such a thing on purpose, particularly if they were to be trusted with the hair of other people. Perhaps it was meant to distract from the arsenal of polished steel loaded into his apron. He set up a chair under a fruit tree in the yard to do his work, maybe to offer a serene setting for the ordeal, maybe to make it easier to clean up the hair, maybe to make it easier to clean up the blood. At the urging of the orphans, Kuro mounted the chair. He was instantly enveloped in a sheet which tied itself roughly around his neck, binding him to the chair. The hairdresser then started running his fingers through Kuro's hair. He made sounds of disapproval as he shifted the uneven mop from side to side. "The Tesla look is fine, I suppose, but if I didn't know better, I would think your last haircut was done with a dull knife." Clearly, he did not know better, as that is exactly how Kuro had previously cut his hair. With a single gesture and no warning, the hairdresser sent an orb of hot, soapy water to engulf Kuro's head. It vigorously scrubbed as the hairdresser presented him with questions for which he had no answer. Do you like the length as it is? How do you feel about the bangs? Where do you like the part? Shall we keep it bohemian or go for something more subdued or more daring?" Kuro mumbled answers while trying to hold his breath, feeling like the whirlpool assaulting his head was creeping forward and might cover his face at any moment. He just kept guessing at answers until the hairdresser was satisfied. Then the blades came. All at once, the water vanished and 3 sets of scissors flew from the hairdresser's apron and attacked. The razor-sharp steel gleamed viciously in the morning sun. Like a school of piranhas, they tore into Kuro's mop of hair, piles of it falling away all around. He tensed every time he felt the cold metal touch his skin, expecting the next thing to fall would be an ear. The hairdresser guided their assault like a conductor, adjusting their paths with a gesture and grinning with malicious glee. After what seemed like hours, he waved away the scissors to make way for the second wave of his army. Combs dug into Kuro's remaining hair, wrestling it into shape and fighting a tug-of-war with tangles. Along with the combs came the creams, strange lotions that oozed up the back of his neck and crept along his scalp. With a clap, it was done. The hairdresser held up a mirror for Kuro's inspection. "Well, what do you think? Très bien, non?" Kuro stared at the boy in the mirror. It was, at the same time, a stranger and unmistakably him. The unruly mop that had disguised him and kept him warm had been shorn away, revealing the unpleasant truth beneath. His blotchy brown skin was fully exposed to the light. His ears stuck out even more prominently, and the dark eyes looking out without the shield provided by his bangs were evasive and fearful. "It's shorter," he said. The hairdresser's smile shattered. In a flash, the sheet was removed and Kuro was ejected from the chair. "You are finished. Next!" As Kuro retreated, he could hear the hairdresser grumbling about ungrateful children and being an unappreciated genius. With his mandatory grooming complete, it was time for the next torture to begin. Kuro marched glumly to the dining hall where the test was to take place. There he was met by Mr. Oganov, the Avalon Junior High evocations teacher. Oganov looked as he usually did, overdressed for the occasion and undersized for his personality. "Kuro, good to see you," he boomed, tossing one side of his high-collared cloak over his shoulder to expose the sharply cut tailcoat beneath. "All ready for the big test?" He was entirely too excited for the boredom that was to ensue. Oganov sat Kuro at a table in the middle of the otherwise empty dining hall and passed him a worryingly thick exam booklet and several more sharpened pencils than Kuro wanted to believe he would need to complete the test. He began writing as fast as he could while Oganov looked on, gently sculpting his beard into a finer and finer point. Kuro's initial anxiety was quickly replaced with shock as he wrote. It was easy. He knew the answers. He actually knew them. He wasn't just writing down half-remembered recreations of stuff he'd seen in a haze of chalk and confusion in class. The words he was putting down meant things. He knew that most of his answers were correct. Not only did he know they were correct, but he knew why they were correct. More than that, he could write them without thinking. His left hand just wrote whole words without him having to pay attention to each stroke of every character. He hadn't noticed how much easier it had gotten, but with all the letters he'd written over the summer, his hand must have, at some point, started knowing what to do without being told. 3 hours later, he found himself staring dumbfounded at a completed exam, his first ever. He was shaken from the distracted state by Oganov informing him that the time was up. He neatly ordered the ream of paper and passed it over to the teacher. "Are you all right, lad? You look a bit pale," said Oganov. "I'm sure it wasn't that bad. You nearly passed last time and you've had all summer to improve. Don't worry about it. Just focus on the next part." Kuro's stomach lurched. In the happy surprise at his ability of the written exam, he'd momentarily allowed himself to forget about the practical portion. Oganov led him out to the lawn to a table that had been prepared for the purpose. The evocations teacher had good cause to set the table outside. When Kuro had done the test at the end of the school year, he'd sent it and everything on it flying into and partially through the far wall. Telekinesis was his bane. Everything else he could do at least poorly. When he tried to move things with his mind, one of the most basic magical skills there are, the best outcome was that nothing happened. It was the same setup as before. A rock, a cup, 2 sticks, and a ring in a line down the long table. Unlike last time, though, people were watching. The whole orphanage was gathered around the table to see Kuro perform, or fail to. With their haircuts complete, Kuro's test was the most interesting thing happening that day. They hovered close to the table, waiting for the underwhelming display to begin. His tutors for the summer, Ari, Johannes, Meredith, and even Bella, jostled for the best position, curious if their tutelage had been sufficient. The younger children, especially the few going into their first year at Avalon, were eager to see what they'd be learning at school. Even Azalea pushed for a spot at the front while attempting to turn the shimmering cascade of waves she'd been given by the hairdresser back into the tangle of vines she typically hid behind. The fight for the best view was frustrated by Oganov, who urged the whole crowd backward. He claimed it was to give Kuro space to work and reduce the pressure on him, but Kuro knew it was entirely for their safety. Kuro approached the first of the challenges, a rock with almost transparent white crystals growing from it. He just had to turn it from quartz to amethyst. He gripped the stone and focused on the right ideas, encouraging his thoughts to make the shape of the hexagonal protrusions from the rock, and then shift their tune to be more ferrous. Minutes ticked by, and the hue of the stone shifted very slightly to pink. It wasn't the deep purple that it should be, but Mr. Oganov nodded in approval and said, "Sufficient! before making an exaggerated check mark on the clipboard. There was polite clapping from the gathered spectators. Kuro moved to the small pair of amber rods. All he needed to do with them was get an arc to jump between them. He focused on the difference between his hands and let that fill the rods with opposite charges. Right and left, correct and incorrect. The one that had served Phineas and the one that belonged to him alone. Crack. It was just a single snap of electricity. Full marks would have required a sustained arc, but he wasn't aiming for the top of the class. He just wanted to have the chance to fight for the bottom of it again. Oganov nodded with satisfaction, and Kuro moved on. Next was a small paper cup filled with water. Kuro encircled the cup with his fingers and focused all his thoughts into the middle. Less than a minute later, the cup was steaming. Then a bubble formed and rolled to the top. It was enough. "Well done," said Oganov, accompanied by a bored smattering of applause. As he prepared to freeze the water, he thought he saw money change hands between Johannes and Bella. He was most confident in this task. He was certain he could do it, just not the way he was supposed to. He couldn't slowly draw off the latent heat in the water through a deep understanding of magical principles. Bella's method was the only one that worked for him. The real challenge was not to turn himself and half the lawn into a glacier. He tapped into his fear, an old ally that kept him alive and out of trouble through the years of thieving. He just let a little of that overwhelming feeling trickle out and tried to guide it into the water. The water froze in seconds. So too did its palms. The concentrated cold shot right through them. He jammed his hands in his pockets and balled up his fists to try to warm them again without looking suspicious. Oganov raised an inquisitive eyebrow at the unusually rapid success, but ticked off a pass on his clipboard regardless. The final challenge taunted him. The little metal ring sat waiting for him to raise it up off the table. It should be trivial, but the skill had always escaped him, and everyone around knew it. He could hear the murmurings of the orphans expressing their doubt and boredom, and he noticed Eri taking bets from the other tutors. He needed to block that out. He needed absolute focus. He let the world fade away. He let the tension he was carrying in his muscles ease. The ring didn't move. That was good. If he tried too hard, there would be an explosion. That was his problem. The thing he knew how to do well was to make the wind blow. And whenever he tried to move something other than himself, via that or any other means, it would blow very hard, very fast, in all directions. Seconds ticked by with nothing happening. Oganov knew Kuro well enough to recognize that as a limited success, but not nearly enough to pass. Kuro tried every trick anyone had ever suggested, trying to feel its shape in his mind, imagining the ring staying still and the ground moving away from it, using hand motions, holding his breath, breathing steadily. Everyone watched his utter incompetence, and he wanted to run. A gentle breeze picked up behind him, offering its help if he chose to accept. He refused its gentle urgings. He was resolved to fight his instincts and pass this test. His denial, though, only increased the strength of the wind. The cup tipped, and the amber rods rolled off the table. When the ring started to slide, he begged the wind to stop, to help him instead of destroying things. To his amazement, the wind relented. The breeze died, and the ring started to rattle, then flipped on end and started to spin, lifting off the table very slightly. A tiny cyclone held the ring up, twirling just above the table. A round of genuine applause from the audience broke his focus. He tried to catch the ring before it fell, but in his hurry, he tried too hard, and the cyclone grew uncontrollably. Everyone dove for cover as the table was torn apart and wood pelted the audience. Oganov shielded himself from the debris with his long black cape. Kuro didn't bother moving. He just let the remains of the table and his hopes rain down on him. As the wind died, Mr. Oganov lowered his cape. He walked to the epicenter of the disaster and examined the ring, still spinning in the air. He stroked his beard, refining the end to a fine point while making curious and contemplative hums. "Technically, a pass," he said. Thank you for listening to Stealing from Wizards. If you liked our show, please consider rating or reviewing on iTunes. If you want to support this podcast or just can't wait for the next chapter, the full book is available on Amazon, Kobo, and Indigo. Our theme music was written by Camille Saint-Saëns, transcribed by Franz Liszt, performed by Rebecca Verdun, and used with permission. This episode was produced by Jim Tigwell.